Well, benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 42 of the Secunda Secundae of St. Thomas Aquinas of the Summa Theologica. The topic for this lecture is sedition, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are still looking at the vices which are contrary to charity, right? So we're in the section on charity, and of the vices contrary to charity, there are some that are contrary to joy, sloth and envy, and there are some that are contrary to peace, and this is the last section, which is contrary to peace, sedition, as you can see here in the green. Next we will move on to scandal, which is contrary to beneficence. So sedition is a special sin. This is only 2 articles, so this is a pretty fast section. Saint Isidore defines, Isidore Seville, not the farmer, he defines sedition as one that sows dissent among the minds and begets discord. So discord comes up repeatedly in this section. So a seditious person sows doubts or dissent among a group of people. Now, St. Thomas says this is similar to war and strife. Right? In some ways, it's like you're dealing with a war or a battle. Right? Sedition is often talked about in those ways, in terms of corrupting the other side in a battle, and in terms of war, you have a seditious act, right? Could cause for a revolution of some kind, right? So it's often talked about in terms of war or strife. But St. Thomas says it's different in 2 ways. In one way, a war and a strife, right? War is a public between one nation and another nation. That's an action, right? It's an outright action. And a confrontation, a battle. Strife is similar, but it's between individuals, right? So a strife isn't between nations, but it's between one member of a society and another member of society. But again, it is outward, it is an action, some type of violence. So sedition is different because it's not always in terms of an outright action. Now, it could be, right? So if somebody were to John Wilkes Booth assassinating Abraham Lincoln was a form of sedition, right? There was a seditious element, and that was an act of violence. It would also have been strife. Right? It would have been both. But you could be seditious and never raise your hand in violence, right? It could be through words. Right? You could tell lies, or you could tell stories. You could sow doubts. There's a lot of ways you could be seditious, which isn't outright violent, although war and strife are always outwardly violent. And the second way it's different than war and strife is that, again, a war is between one nation and another nation. Okay. Strife is between one individual and another individual, or maybe a small group of individuals. Maybe Romeo and Juliet, you have the Montagues and the Capulets, right? This could still be strife between these 2 small groups, versus sedition, which he says is between mutually dissenting parts of one people. So this would be like the Democrats going after the Republicans, or the Republicans against the Democrats. The majority of a people, of a majority of a country, kind of fits into one of these 2 political camps. So for the one party to try to overthrow the other party would be sedition, right? It's not talking about individuals, it's not talking about different nations, it's within the same nation, big factions, bigger than the Capulets and the Montagues, right? Bigger than that. St. Thomas also points out that this is between, this is it is like schism, right? But schism deals with ecclesiastical matters. Sedition is more political. It's more of a political thing, secular. But they are both forms of discord, right? The point is that they sow division, right? Discord is a contradiction of wills, right? That they will different things. This is true of schism, and this is true of sedition. Both of them also have a differing of wills, right? Discord among the wills of the people, but they are different, right? But they kind of both fall under the umbrella of discord. The next question is sedition a mortal sin? And the answer is both yes and no, right? Although the one thing St. Thomas doesn't talk about is it being a venial sin. So it really comes down to, well, if sedition is a sin, it's most likely a mortal sin, but not everything which we might call sedition might be sedition. So really, what's the defining factor whether sedition is a sin or not? It's really a matter of justice. It kind of really boils down to justice, which is kind of strange because, right, we're under the section of charity. So how is it both charity and justice? So in terms of it being charity, right, if you have charity, you have love of God for God's own sake. You are abiding in God and enjoying God for God's own sake. You are friends with God for God's own sake, not because what you can get out of it. This charity then extends into your love of neighbor, because God created and loves your neighbor too, right? So you end up loving your neighbor as another self, right? You have friendship with your neighbor out of the love of God, not for their own sake, right? You might love your neighbor for their own sake, as a form of philia or eros or agape. But this is out of charity. You love your neighbor out of your love for God, right? So out of this love of God and love of neighbor then comes a unity, right? If your neighbor loves God and you love God and God loves God and we are all working together, there is a unity here, right? Which then creates peace, right? If you now say, well, I'm going to rip this government apart, right? We're going to create a civil war, right? We're going to have a division where neighbor is against neighbor, brother against brother, son against father, and father against son, right? This idea is the contrary of peace, right? Therefore, it is contrary to charity. But whether or not we know if something is seditious or not really sometimes comes down to justice. So if you are doing that type of division, dividing a nation, presuming you have a good and holy nation, if you were to create division within your good and holy nation, you are committing a mortal sin, right? Because it is against peace. St. Thomas says, the unity to which sedition is opposed is the unity of law and the common good, right? So when you do seditious acts, you are going against the common good. Now, what if, and this kind of naturally comes up, well, what if the person who is being seditious is going against a tyrannical government, right? What if it were the American Revolution, right? We'd never have the United States if we didn't have seditious, colonialists who rebelled against the king, right? Could you be a good seditionist, right? For the sake of, right now with the war of Ukraine and Russia, if you had somebody who opposed Putin within the Russian government, could that be good sedition, right? To try to depose Vladimir Putin. Well, what St. Thomas points to is tyrants do not care about the common good. Right? That's part of this definition, the common good. Right? Tyrants don't care about the common good or the unity of the law. They only care about their own private good. Right? They only care about themselves. That's kind of what a tyrant does. So if it's a good government, it cares about the common good and the unity of law. Right? So if you are seditious against a tyrant, it is not sedition, right? Because it is actually in favor of justice. Because the tyrant is against justice by only caring about their private good and not the common good. So in that way, you would say, well, it sounds like sedition, right? You're creating dissidence, right? There's discord among the factions within the government. But St. Thomas would say, well, that's not sedition, though, right? Because it's called justice, right? Call it justice, right? And it's doing sedition. If we go back to strife, or right, if it isn't sedition, if the aim of it is peace, right? If the aim of war is peace, it can be a just war, right? If that's the goal. But St. Thomas also gives another exception within this description, right? So does that mean because we have a tyrant, we should overthrow the government? Sedition is good. And St. Thomas points out, consequently, there is no sedition in disturbing a government of this kind, right? A tyrannical government, unless indeed the tyrant's rule to be disturbed so inordinately that his subjects suffer greater harm from the consequent disturbance than from the tyrant's government, right? So if we look at something like Saddam Hussein's rule, for example, we could say, we've kind of learned some lessons from that. We could say Saddam Hussein is a tyrant, slaughters people, kills people, really cares about his own private good, not the good of the common good, right? He doesn't really care about the common good. He only cares about himself, and he's brutal, right? Saddam Hussein, not a good man, right? You could say, well, then we could be seditious and overthrow Saddam Hussein. Now, knowing what we know now, we can look and say, well, but if you do, there may be a greater harm for the common good than if you have a tyrant, right? What happens if you overthrow Saddam Hussein? You're going to end up with these. Saddam Hussein kind of kept a level of secularism within the country. You will have ISIS take over, and then women will be in burqas, and they will control everything, and they will try to fight the West, and everybody will be oppressed under their very conservative Islamic rule. This would be worse than Saddam Hussein, right? And in the meantime, there'll be battles and car bombs and all this other innocent people being blown up, which did not happen under Saddam Hussein, because if somebody did something like that, he would destroy them and kill all their family and everything else, right? So he was a tyrant, but he was better than the chaos which would have come out of him being overthrown, right? Just as an example, and you could disagree with that particular case, but just as a generalized example, I think it kind of helps you understand kind of what he means, right? So some of this you don't really know, right? You could say, well, it would be better if we overthrow Kim Jong-un because then it would bring in democracy. We don't really know, right? Maybe not. Could bring in somebody even worse, but you don't really know. You could say the same for Russia, right? Overthrowing Putin, maybe it would create something worse. Probably not, but you don't quite know, right? So it's not seditious if it brings out the common good. If it doesn't bring out the common good, then it is seditious and it's not appropriate. So in conclusion, sedition is a special sin, right? It's a little bit like war and a little bit like strife, but it's different because it doesn't have to be an action, an act of violence. Could be preparation for an act of violence. And it's also between large groups of the same population. Sedition is also mostly a mortal sin because if it goes against the common good and the unity of law, then it is bad. If it goes against a tyrant, then we just don't call it sedition, right? We call it justice. Okay, so that is it for vices contrary to peace.